V.S. Naipaul's Miguel Street, Trinidad in miniature. I hope reading this book put a smile on your face. For me, Miguel Street was one of the first non-Western or world literature written in English books I ever read in college. This work inspired me to learn more about other cultures, countries, and writers beyond the United States. It also sparked me to read more of Naipaul's works. One thing that enhances the reading experience for this book is V.S. Naipaul's jovial yet descriptive style. This book tries to portray Trinidad, specifically a small, street-centered enclave in Port of Spain, around the late 1930s to the mid-1940s during World War II. What I hope to offer in this presentation are a few key points of information to make this book more enjoyable. In the end, I think Naipaul shows us his country in miniature. V.S. Naipaul, out of respect I will not try to pronounce his full name, has been one of the most prolific writers of the Caribbean, writing 13 works of fiction and 19 works of nonfiction. I would classify his fiction into three major categories. Number 1, fiction about Trinidad, his earliest novels, The Mystic Monsieur, Miguel Street, and his masterpiece, A House for Mr. Biswas. Number 2, fiction of exile, The Mimic Men, The Enigma of Arrival, and Half a Life. And 3, transnational fiction, In a Free State, A Bend in the River, and Away in the World. Before moving on to his nonfiction, let me briefly outline these categories. His early fiction looks at Trinidad with nuanced attention to detail and quite a profound sense of humor. We will look at these tendencies in Miguel Street shortly. These works alone would have made Naipaul an important Caribbean writer. However, it is really his fiction of exile that marks him as one of the most significant writers from Trinidad and the Caribbean. Indeed, Naipaul is part of the Windrush generation, a label derived from the ship MV Empire Windrush that ferried a large influx of Caribbean immigrants into Great Britain from 1948 to 1971 due to post-war labor shortages throughout the British Empire. This generation was complicated more by their status as colonials, making them British subjects with citizenship in the UK, but without infrastructures that promoted seamless integration or assimilation into British society and its economy. Naipaul, and Samuel Sylvan in his Lonely Londoners, writes about arriving and living in Britain as a former colonial. Indeed, in his The Mimic Men, Naipaul writes about the terrible displacement and disillusionment of these individuals living far away from their homes. He says of this book, "It was not about mimics. It was about colonial men mimicking the condition of manhood, men who had grown to distrust everything about themselves. This distrust is part of living in a colony." I would recommend reading The Mimic Men to learn more about the post-colonial literature. And personally, it has one of the most beautiful descriptions of snow from someone who has never seen it in his tropical home. In his transnational fiction, which often emerged parallel with his travels, Naipaul writes about being caught between two or more cultures. Most importantly, he presents an argument that this push and pull between cultures has been occurring throughout the world since the age of exploration, if not before. Additionally, he encourages people to see this situation as a potentially positive development versus a detriment. I would encourage you to read more of his fiction. I would classify his nonfiction also into three categories. Number 1, history of colonization and its effects. Number 2, personal travelogues to find himself. And number 3, literary criticism. All his nonfiction is full of history and offers his personal take on the historical situations and/or settings. I will just highlight a few examples. For the first category, history of colonization and its effects, I would recommend The Loss of El Dorado. El Dorado was the mythic city of gold supposedly found in the New World. Believed to be in various locations throughout the New World, this, quote, lost city, as the conquistador said, would offer countless riches and legendary immortality. One imagined location for El Dorado was Trinidad. In The Loss of El Dorado, Naipaul provides an extensive history of his home nation and the difficult relationship it had with European powers. For the second category, personal travelogues to find himself, I would recommend An Area of Darkness, his book about living in India, the first in a trilogy of works about India. An Area of Darkness has a wide-eyed attention to detail, one that allows readers to identify with Naipaul's quest as he tries to learn about his ancestry. For the third category, literary criticism, I would recommend The Writer and the World, a work that explores his relationship to the world and his ideas about writing. I would encourage you to read more of his nonfiction. Before moving on to other slides, I want to offer some key ideas from his Nobel lecture entitled Two Worlds from 2001. The final quote above is from that lecture. Being an intuitive writer means that he seeks to follow his passion and mind. He notes, I've trusted to intuition. I did it at the beginning. I do it even now. I have no idea how things might turn out, where in my writing I might go next. I've trusted to my intuition to find the subjects, and I've written intuitively. I have an idea when I start, I have a shape, but I will fully understand what I have written only after some years. It also suggests to me that curiosity and intellectual fulfillment are very important for his writing and life. He begins the lecture by proclaiming that everything of value about me is in my books. He elaborates on this idea. I will say I am the sum of my books, each book intuitively sensed out, and, in the case of fiction, intuitively worked out, stands on what has gone before and grows out of it. I feel that at any stage of my literary career, it could have been said that the last book contained all the others. In this way, he blossoms as a writer. Yet he understands the frustrations many critics have had about his writing, which is that he presents so many different variants and styles, topics and focuses, that it becomes nearly impossible to label or categorize him. He says, so just as there is a development in my work, a development in narrative skill and knowledge and sensibility, so there is a kind of unity, a focus, though I might appear to be going in many directions. While this idea certainly emerges from reading more of his works, I think this last idea applies to Miguel Street, for you may not see one clear focus, but many. Still, the book allows us to see a unity in the work, which for me is a love of the characters he writes about. As a means of conclusion, Naipaul's life and works coincide wonderfully. He offers new ways of looking at our world. In Miguel Street, we're looking at a small enclave of people in Port of Spain. The map on the right shows the islands of Trinidad and Tobago. The novel takes place in Port of Spain, the capital of this two-island nation. This video will not explain a lot of the history of Trinidad and Tobago, nor the life in Port of Spain. For more context, please watch my YouTube video about Trinidad and Tobago and C.L.R. James, a peer of V.S. Naipaul. Naipaul, for his part, describes Trinidad as a unique place. I was born in Trinidad. It is a small island, about 1.5 the size of Rhode Island, in the mouth of the great Orinoco River of Venezuela. So Trinidad is not strictly of South America and not strictly of the Caribbean. It was developed as a New World plantation colony, and when I was born in 1932, it had a population of about 400,000. Of this, about 150,000 were Indians, Hindus, and Muslims, nearly all of peasant origin, and nearly all of the Gangetic Plain. As he explained, people of Indian descent are a major part of Trinidad's population, which Naipaul contextualizes. The bulk of this migration from India occurred after 1880. The deal was like this. People indentured themselves for 5 years to serve on the estates. At the end of this time, they were given a small piece of land, perhaps 5 acres, or a passage back to India. In 1917, because of agitation by Gandhi and others, the indentured system was abolished. And perhaps because of this, or for some other reason, the pledge of land and repatriation was dishonored for many of the later arrivals. These people were absolutely destitute. They slept in the streets of Port of Spain, the capital. When I was a child, I saw them. I suppose I didn't know they were destitute. I suppose that came much later. And they made no impression on me. This was part of the cruelty of the plantation colony. As I explained in my other YouTube videos, the plantation system and colonialism impacted generations of Caribbean peoples. The urbanization of Port of Spain rapidly and permanently changed the capital and Trinidad as a whole. Naipaul's birthplace was in Chaguanas, which he explains as a town with a strange name in spelling and pronunciation. In his Nobel lecture, he describes how he learns about the history of his hometown, a history that was only available to him in London. He knows how the Aboriginal people who made up Trinidad and who provided his town with its name were silenced from history. The people who had been dispossessed would have had their own kind of agriculture, their own calendar, their own codes, their own sacred sites, they would have understood the Orinoco-fed currents in the Gulf of Parara. Now, all their skills and everything else about them had been obliterated. Remarkably, Naipaul lets this knowledge inform him beyond the history of his hometown, for he draws conclusions about all of Trinidad and the Caribbean, and perhaps the rest of the world. He says, "The world is always in movement. People have everywhere at some time been dispossessed." I suppose I was shocked by this discovery in 1967 about my birthplace, because I had never had any idea about it. But that was the way most of us lived in the agricultural colony, blindly. There was no plot by the authorities to keep us in our darkness. I think it was more simply that the knowledge wasn't there. The kind of knowledge about the Chihuahuas would not have been considered important, and it would not have been easy to recover. They were a small tribe, and they were aboriginal. When he travels to Venezuela in his 40s, he learns that these aborigines eventually immigrated to the interiors of Venezuela and Guyana. This, quote, discovery was not really a discovery, for the Chihuahuas were never lost. They controlled their destinies when invasions occurred. What was discovered was a silenced history that was blinded from the colonials in Trinidad. Because of this absence of knowledge, this gap in history, Naipaul finds that people in Trinidad made their own communities, which allowed him to see his childhood as living between two worlds. So as a child, I had this sense of two worlds, the world outside, that tall corrugated iron gate, and the world at home, or at any rate, the world of my grandmother's house. It was a remnant of our caste system, the thing that excluded and shut out. In Trinidad, whereas new arrivals we were a disadvantaged community, that excluding idea was a kind of protection. It enabled us, for the time being, and only for the time being, to live in our own way and according to our own rules, to live in our own fading India. It made for an extraordinary self-centeredness. We looked inwards, we lived out our days, the world outside existed in a kind of darkness, we inquired about nothing. As he matured, though, and devoted himself to writing, Naipaul tried and still tries to illuminate these areas of darkness. When I became a writer, those areas of darkness around me as a child became my subjects. The land, the Aborigines, the New World, the colony, the history, India, the Muslim world, to which I also felt myself related, Africa, and then England, where I was doing my writing. That is what I mean when I said that my books stand one on the other, and that I am the sum of my books. Naipaul's personal enlightened math, hence the sum of his books, is important because it allows us to see his works in the context of his life experiences and travels. For this reason and others, Miguel Street embodies the earliest period of his life. The narrator, who is unnamed and perhaps a fictional version of Naipaul himself, tells the stories of all the various people and the dramas on the street. The stories are unified through this narrative voice, but they maintain their own integrity, plots, and themes. In many ways, the book operates similar to a cycle novel or a short story cycle, much like Sherwood Anderson's Winesburg, Ohio, or the Trinidadian precursor C.L.R. James's Minty Alley, again discussed on my YouTube channel. I will talk more about the characters shortly. No doubt the stories are influenced by the arrival of Americans to the island. The United States acquired land on Trinidad with a diplomatic exchange from Great Britain. In his amazingly detailed history of this time entitled Caliban and the Yankee, Trinidad and the United States Occupation, Harvey Neptune explains the setup. By a quick diplomatic exchange on September 2, 1940, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt and Great Britain's Prime Minister Winston Churchill agreed that the tiny Caribbean territory would accommodate extensive U.S. naval and air bases. In return, the British received 50 old American destroyers, which helped to fight off Hitler's blitzkrieg. For the United States, Trinidad and other Caribbean islands provided a much-needed defense network. Neptune explains. Strategically situated at the crossroads of the Atlantic, the 1,900 square mile territory guarded paths to North and South America, to the prized Panama Canal westward, and to the peerless combat zones eastward. The island would be called upon to do decisive sentinel duty, and indeed was worth, the tale went, 40 of the 50 destroyers. Apocryphal as it might be, this claim has the merit of highlighting Trinidad's distinction as the host of the largest, by far, of the new military installations in the British Caribbean-based colonies, as these islands would soon be labeled. This occupation ushered in a more prominent role for the United States in the Caribbean region. This occupation also brought change in Trinidad. The American newcomers, according to Neptune, ensured their ubiquity and import by having their presence within the colony's most urbanized county, St. George, and by aggrandizing the value of the area. Specifically, the Navy insisted, against the stubborn protests of Trinidadian Governor Herbert Young, on an 11 square mile spread of land in Chaguaramas, a village at the tip of Trinidad's northwest peninsula, and a mere 20-minute jeep ride west of the capital city of Port of Spain. The Army went east, securing 18 square miles in the forested environs of Kumoto. Although relatively removed from the capital, 20 miles away, this settlement was practically contiguous with the eastern edge of Arima, the most recent of Trinidad's 3 boroughs. For shipping purposes, Americans acquired a sizable swath of the wharf of Port of Spain's Gulf of Para coast, and for general convenience, they extracted the immediate hinterland along Wrightson Road. The U.S. military subsequently procured sites elsewhere in the capital, St. Clair and Laventille, and the colony Chiquianas. But it was the Port of Spain dock site and the 2 bases that provided most consequence. Taken together, these facilities traversed Trinidad's densest residential settlement, the east-west corridor that ran along the foothills of the Northern Range. Unlike other more imperious and comprehensive reformist missions in Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Haiti earlier in the 20th century, where constitutions were revised or altered to favor U.S. business and political interests, Americans in Trinidad had come primarily to guard a British possession, not to seize or reorganize an unruly republic. Moreover, this $90 million mission made Americans an immediate impressive source of employment and economic activity. While only a brief interaction in Trinidad, the U.S. occupation did change the country. This change also dramatically influenced the culture. Americans were received as representatives of a metropolitan space storied for its modern achievements. As bosses, models, patrons, and partners, these occupiers landed on the island with doubtless currency. Neptune shows how the Americans allowed the islanders, particularly the lower classes, to demand social and political change. He notes, during these years it was the subaltern crowd, the poor, women, and youth, that found most utility in and moved most avidly to make something new out of America. As can be seen in the character Miguel Street, the American influence on society and culture in Trinidad was profound. Neptune offers one small observation about how society evolved quickly by seeing non-elites negotiate American money, men, and modes of being in ways that questioned everything from the conditions of domestic labor to the convention of tucking shirts and trousers. American influence, in other words, made Trinidadians rethink everything, from the trivial to the major, including its colonial dependency. Calypso, one of the many musical art forms found in Trinidad, was and is the voice for a changing society. Michael Toussaint outlines the fundamentals of the development of Calypso as a primarily Afro-based musical genre, and as a sustained art form by Afro-Trinidadians. In many ways, Calypso embodies the personality of Trinidad. As Caribbean Currents, a history of the entire musical traditions throughout the region explains, Trinidadian national character, insofar as one can generalize, acquired a rather difficult hue from that of other British colonies. The French Creole cultural base, the relative prosperity, the brevity of the slave era, and the comparative mildness of British colonial rule in Trinidad seem to have favored the development of an easygoing national culture that prizes humor and fun over Puritanism or pathos. According to musical historian Mark Brill, above all, Calypso highlighted the oral abilities of its performers. Their verbal dexterity determined the success of their songs and stories, which were often peppered with ribald and humorous plays on words, innuendos, and double meanings. Furthermore, Peter Manuel elaborates, ribaldry and sarcasm remained the genre's mainstay, and the lyrics continued to show delight in mocking pretensions, exposing elite scandals, and ridiculing upper-class women. A favorite topic has always been the complications caused by the hoary Trinidadian male custom of maintaining one or more deputies or mistresses along with a wife. We can see these examples in the novel. Two of the most famous examples of Calypso are the videos on the right, listed in the playlist for the course. The top video is Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat Song, also known as Deo. The song chronicles the struggles of a banana harvester who wants to go home after work. The other video, on the bottom right, is Lord Invader's Rum and Coca-Cola. It became a hit in 1943 due to the prosperity that came with the U.S. occupation in Trinidad. It also became an anthem for the U.S. annexation of the U.S. Virgin Islands. I discuss this song more in my Tiffany Unique video on my YouTube channel. Calypso, with its sarcasm and wordplay, can be appreciated in excerpts, like in the book, or studied as a form of popular literature. Calypso, though, encourages dancing. Bill agrees. Calypso was not only intended for a sitting audience, it was also meant to be danced, particularly in the midst of carnival celebrations. Indeed, carnival and calypso belong together. Gordon Roller, a cultural and literary scholar, explains how important carnival and calypso are. Calypso, and to some extent carnival, have stirred to celebrate and expand a special festive freedom in the scope of festive laughter. He continues, the evolution of the social and political calypso has been similar to that of the Trinidad Carnival, which has, in all its faces, phases, and manifestations, been both a theater and a metaphor of the process through which the still living drama of Trinidad's social history has both been encoded and enacted. Essentially, Carnival, like Calypso, has been a celebratory mass/moss theater of contested social space, a drama of ritualized verbal and violently physical challenge. While Carnival is absent in Miguel Street, we can see how the Calypso functions like a Greek chorus in the novel, commenting on social and personal experiences with humor and power. The Calypsonian, or the performer, thus plays an important role in society, a role that has tremendous theoretical power. The Calypsonian, master and keeper of all verbal codes with popular Creole culture, has assumed the role of decoder and unmasker of the new slogans and codes and masks that each political regime uses. The videos above confirm this belief. Additionally, Calypso performs a number of key functions of which the Calypsonian is conscious and which serve as motivation, although the needs of individual performers vary. When Calypsonians perform, they exhibit their notions about identity and consciousness, even an Afrocentric consciousness. By tracing the Calypso references in the book, we can better understand Trinidadian society. Overall, Calypso plays an integral role in Miguel Street, offering commentary to domestic abuse, political change, and cultural mores. As a final slide, I want to highlight a few characters to show the book's humor. Additionally, Naipaul, through his characters, shows us Trinidad in miniature. The narrator is very unjudgmental, acting more like a reporter than an active participant in the themes of the stories. Because of this strategy, the young boy does not or cannot comment on domestic violence or other ills on the street. As contemporary readers, we probably feel tension and stress when we encounter the moments of domestic abuse, both spousal and child. It would be easy to dismiss these scenes as signs of the times or as just the way things are in this culture. You may still want to do that. However, I would encourage you to see the root causes of these moments because they reveal a lot about the society and culture. For instance, the second paragraph above describes Mrs. Baku and Mrs. Morgan. I hope you can see the humor in their characterizations. Also, Naipaul shows that these women, as extensions of their men, argue and potentially scuffle. The root of these instances of violence between the women, for example, are not only in their personalities, but in the circumstances surrounding their men who are not successful, particularly in finances and means. The women act out to mollify that inadequacy. There are other moments where a character had to beat his wife. This behavior is not acceptable. However, Naipaul honestly walks through the characters' minds to show their reasonings. Again, the domestic violence belies deeper issues that should be considered. The kernel of Miguel Street starts with Naipaul's childhood. He explains this fact in his Nobel lecture. At last one day, there came to me the idea of starting with the Port of Spain street to which we had moved from Chaguanas. There was no big corrugated iron gate shutting out the world there. The life on the street was open to me. It was an intense pleasure for me to observe it from the veranda. This street life was what I began to write about. I wished to write fast to avoid too much self-questioning, and so I simplified. I suppressed the child narrator's background. I ignored the racial and social complexities of the street. I explained nothing. I stayed at ground level, so to speak. I presented people only as they appeared on the street. We can see this style in Naipaul's characterization of Bolo. The young narrator simply sees sadness, and everything about him reflects that tone. I think Bolo was born sad. Certainly I never saw him laugh, except in a sarcastic way, and I saw him at least once a week for 11 years. He was a tall man, not thin, with a face that was a caricature of sadness, the mouth curling downwards, the eyebrows curving downwards, the eyes big and empty of expression. Bolo may or may not be the sad clown, or the tramp the narrator explains. What is important, though, is that Bolo represents a certain type of man in Port of Spain. Similarly, the chapter on Laura, entitled Maternal Instincts, seems to sidetrack from the humorous portrayals, but it captures a woman struggling to live her life among the often transient populace in the capital. Additionally, the chapter Love, Love, Love Alone breaks from the book's pattern to show another segment of Trinidadian society, people who can reinvent themselves in the metropolis of Port of Spain. Taken together, the stories in Miguel Street show Trinidad in miniature with honesty and humor. Please use these sources to explore the book and the author more.